Buras, Louisiana, 1 year ago. The church, the graveyard, the street, and the school have been photographed so often they began to resemble a stage set for the third act of a classic tragedy. For 15 days, until the last student dropped out, this newly desegregated parochial school was in a state of virtual siege. Television flashed the scene to the nation last fall. The central characters in the drama could almost be the leading players in an allegory on the ancient contest between good and evil. The pastor, a Franciscan priest, Father Chris Schneider.
Parents want to send their children and simply were afraid of economic reprisals and damage to property and also threats of physical violence.
A year ago, newspapers throughout America front-paged a 4-column picture of the protesters. Prominent in the picture was the rural political boss credited with making sure the school had no students, Leander Henry Perez.
I'm not bragging, sir, but I said we are not surrendering our schools to anybody, and that means anyone. I say the Archbishop, and I've said it before, I think he's earned the punishment of hell for selling out on his people.
Father Schneider's last student dropped out of this school almost exactly 1 year ago today. And for 349 days, these open doors of an empty schoolhouse symbolized the duel between the spiritual power of religion and the politics of race. Then, 3 weeks ago, one of the sisters at the school received a phone call.
When I answered the phone, it was a woman's voice. She asked when school would begin and in what school we would be teaching. Before she hung up, she said, "If you take those Negroes into our new white school, it will be blown to pieces with you in it."
That same night, a blast rocked the school.
Now, here is Dan Rather, Chief of CBS News Southern Bureau, New Orleans.
Good evening. In the intensive coverage of the 9-year racial crisis in the South, 2 elements of the overall story have gone almost unreported. One is the role of the church, where indeed it has chosen to play any role. The other is the anatomy of the rural political leader and the sources of his sometimes crucial power. In Plaquemine Parish, Louisiana, these 2 forces have met head-on. There, in the absence of Negro organization, where the courts and the federal government have yet to act, the church, in this instance, the Roman Catholic Church, has taken a determined stand. Father Chris Schneider is the priest on the scene, armed with whatever spiritual power his small pulpit and the backing of his church give him. Facing him in a duel of wills is Leander Perez, perhaps the most powerful old-style political boss remaining in the United States, a Southern segregationist whose grip on his people is all but absolute. In the short-term look at this story, seen through day-to-day flashes of violence, it might appear that Judge Perez is winning. This report is a long-range appraisal of the struggle as our camera watched it over the past 18 months.
In 1956, Archbishop Joseph F. Rummel, in a pastoral letter, declared that segregation was sinful. Later, he announced that the parochial schools of the New Orleans Archdiocese would be desegregated. The final order came in 1962. Leander Perez, himself a Catholic, reacted with public attacks on the Archbishop and his order.
The men who led our Catholic Church and who had our respect before have lost the right to all decency and respect of their fellow men. That is how low a person will stoop when he gets caught, when he's sold his soul.
Leander Perez described parochial school desegregation as the payoff of a conspiracy and bribe involving communists, the Jews, the president, and the Catholic hierarchy.
But $3 million grant to the hierarchy in New Orleans supposedly to build an apartment house for old folks. Well, now that Mr. Catholic President Kennedy has set the example of paying off $3 million to the Catholic hierarchy here, what's he going to do when the pressure is put on him by the Protestant Christian leaders, such as this Bishop Oxnam, a fellow traveler in Atlanta, That takes us back just 1962 years ago when a Judas took 30 pieces of silver. But the price has gone up, my friends. $3 million is the first installment. But regardless of the price, there's no such thing as the price is right on the heads of our fine little girls and boys. Out of 34 parochial schools, if you will check, you see that 16 of them had only 1 or 2 burrheads. There were 4 others that had 3 or 4 little pickaninnies. There's just barely 100 in the 24 integrated schools. But that's only the foot in the door policy, because they will pour into those schools in the proportion that the white people lose their nerve and lose their courage and abandon their children to a life of immorality and indecency with these filthy little Negroes who don't know what legitimacy means in the first place. Can you imagine the future of America with all the white children being driven out of our public schools in the end, and that's what is going to happen gradually? What is the future of our country? Why the communist conspiracy to deprive our white youth of educational opportunities?
That night, the Prouts received a phone call.
They called before that morning. They called around 3 o'clock that morning. They start calling. And the first call, they said that they heard that we were sending our children to the integrated school, and that if we would send our children, they was going to burn us out and every other nigger in Boothville. That's the way they said it.
They had took everything I had there, so there ain't nothing much more could happen.
Our people in Blackman Parish have stood the test of ravaging hurricanes. This is the worst, because this would strike at the very foundation of your homes, the protection of your children, and your right to raise your children as good, moral American citizens.
Climbed a willow tree to the roof of the schoolhouse, carrying 3 5-gallon cans of gasoline. A fuse was made from 40 feet of string. Most of the gasoline was poured down this vent to a heater in the classroom below. More gasoline was poured along the line of the string, and finally, just before midnight, the fuse was lit. After the explosion, Father Schneider told us about the damage.
We found the room still full of smoke, and it was apparent that a pretty good deal of damage had been done. Both walls were blown out, the one on the upper side more severely than the one on the low side of the building. The ceiling of the room was completely charred, and the blocks, top blocks, the wall leading to the adjoining classroom were blown out.
Judge, you acknowledge you are the genuine leader of these people in this parish. Let's suppose that the people who were responsible for, say, the explosion at the school turned out to be influenced by you and what you have said about the school. How would you feel about that?
Now look, you are not going to pin any responsibility directly or indirectly upon me for any overt act which is improper. I do not decry the activities of our people in resisting and in objecting in any way they can to the unlawful, unchristian, unmoral actions of the hierarchy of their local priest to deprive them of their property, to deprive their children of the private Christian education which they had planned and for which they paid.
Now, you don't condone violence such as the explosion, do you?
Now let me say, you're not going to have me to say that I am against violence if it is a matter of self-defense. I am not going to surrender, and I don't want to see our people surrender to the communist conspiracy. Violence in certain cases is absolutely justified under the law. And I will not say that I'm against violence as a matter of self-defense. I personally would use violence as a matter of self-defense.
If the parochial school in Buras is reopened on an integrated basis, would you recommend that the people do the same as they did before?
I don't have to recommend. I know that the people will resist it. And will resist it to the utmost with whatever may be necessary to prevent the Archbishop from stealing their school and turning it over to the Negroes.
Now, Judge, this is going to be a long question, and it may be our last. You now have as your enemies, your opponents, at least the last 4 presidents of the United States: President Kennedy, President Eisenhower, President Truman, President Roosevelt, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Earl Warren, other justices of the Supreme Court, the late Pope John, Cardinal Cushing of Boston, a man that some people consider in the forefront of a fight against communism, the last 2 attorneys general, a number of governors of this state of Louisiana. You also have as your enemies, your sworn opponents, such institutions as the United States government, parts at least of the Roman Catholic Church, the National Council of Churches, the Departments of Justice, Interior, to some extent the Department of Defense, the United States Navy, the United Nations. This is a formidable list. Many of these people and many of these institutions are considered among the most popular, the most respected of our time and our era. Now, where does all of this end? Can you win?
Well, if that question is correct, then I must be completely annihilated and liquidated. I don't concede it, however.
Well, isn't the tide of history running against you?
I cannot subscribe to the principle of surrender and the brainwashed technique of saying, it's bound to happen, so what? Let's lie down and die. Let them kick our teeth out. Let the American people forget that they are men. Let them forget our proud tradition of standing up for America. It's bound to happen, so what? Let it happen. And then let the American people be reduced to the condition of degraded slaves, to a foreign ideology. I can't subscribe to that. And I don't believe I'm as lonesome as your question would imply. I'm not alone.
In the running conflict between segregationists and integrationists, there are sharp differences and room for opposing points of view. But the struggle between Judge Perez and his kind and Father Schneider and his kind is something more than that. A contest between good and evil, we called it at the start of this report, and neither side is likely to deny it. Each denounces the other as evil. Each sees himself on God's side.